coming up.
One of the biggest risks that isn't in your report here is, of course, the risk of government itself. In your analysis is the risk brought on by government, including what they announced 2 weeks ago, where they're looking at cutting production from Canada. So that's going to be a risk not just to the value of this project, but to energy security around the world.
Those delays and the lack of clarity and certainty by the government is what ultimately chased them away and then forced the government to step in and buy this pipeline, right?
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Now, I would like to welcome our guests for today's study from the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, Yves Giroux, Parliamentary Budget Officer, and Jason Stanton, Advisor and Analyst. Welcome to our committee.
Let me just go through this. Before this pipeline was built, Canada had oil pipeline capacity of 4,690,000 barrels per day. The extra 590,000 barrels per day of expansion that the TMX brought to Canada brings us to 5,280 barrels per day of expansion. What that has accomplished in the time it's been open is a reduction in what's called the differential. And the differential applies to all those 5.28 barrels. And that differential was US 1865 a barrel last summer. And this summer, because of the opening of the pipeline, it's US 1505 per barrel. So about 360 US, let's call it $5 Canadian differential across 5.28 million barrels per day equals an extra bump to the Canadian economy of $9.5 billion and an extra tax take to the government of $2.8 billion per year. Were any of these numbers included in your analysis?
The analysis looks at the financials involved in the transaction of buying the pipeline and making its expansion effective, as well as the potential cost of an acquirer, somebody who would buy the pipeline. It does not take into account the broader benefits. However, in previous reports, we estimated that a reduction in the price discount at which Western Canada Select sells of $5, and that was prior to the pandemic, that would entail additional benefits to the country of $6 billion for every segment of $5 in reduction in the discount at which WCS sells. So there are obviously broader benefits, which is probably why the government decided to proceed with the purchase and the expansion of the pipeline.
Well, thank you. One of the biggest risks that isn't in your report here is, of course, the risk of government itself. And the risk the government brings to this equation is consistent with the Minister of Environment's report last week, where we actually are cutting him. He plans to cut emissions in Canada at a rate by 2032 that is, according to every player in industry, an indication that we're going to have to cut production by 1 million barrels per day. So take that 5,280,000 barrels per day and turn it down by 1 million per day. Number one, it's, as Eric Nuttall, a portfolio manager, said, it's economic idiocy. And as the minister himself says, look around the world, no other major oil and gas producer is doing what we're doing. In your opinion, this 1 million barrels per day of reduced capacity, will that have an effect on the sale price potentially of the TMX pipeline?
It's hard to assess exactly what the impact of the cap on oil and gas emissions will or could have on the value of the Trans Mountain pipeline. There is quite a bit of uncertainty with respect to the pricing of such a unique asset, especially given the lifespan of the asset, which we have estimated at 40 years, but could be longer than 40 years. There are pipelines that are functioning well after the initial first 40 years of their building and entering into operation. So I can't pronounce really on the impact solely of the cap on oil and gas emissions. We haven't yet studied that, but there is work underway in my office to look at the economic impacts of the cap on oil and gas emissions, for which regulations were very recently released.
Well, thank you. The toll that Alberta, Saskatchewan, British Columbia shippers pay to get to Westridge Terminal from the producing fields and the storage facilities is almost $1 higher than it is to get to the Gulf Coast in the U.S. Much shorter distance, but a higher toll. Can you tell us what impact that will have as a result of the great cost excesses built into building this TMX pipeline?
So my understanding of the tolling framework is that it guarantees a certain return to the operator. So the higher the cost of building the expansion and operating the pipeline means that the tolls have to be higher for ultimately for the users of that pipeline. So cost increases have to be passed at least partly onto the users. So it increases the cost that oil producers have to pay to use the pipeline, and that probably leads to situations such as the one you mentioned.
So that would lead towards what we call the economic idiocy of making our oil and gas production more expensive in Canada vis-a-vis the oil it displaces around the world. Would you agree?
Well, the higher the cost of building a pipeline means that in order to guarantee a certain return to the owner, it has to lead to higher tolls, other things being equal.
Final question here, Mr. Giroux. Do you think there's any connection between an emissions cap and the value of the pipeline at the end of the day?
Ultimately, yes, because...
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was assessed that TMX will generate $92.3 billion in direct and indirect economic benefits to Canada and Canadians over the next 10 years. But your report didn't look at all the impacts. You didn't consider the profits generated by the pipeline while it is owned by our government, and you didn't include the federal tax revenues from the project. Why did you choose to exclude those benefits from your report?
Because in our view, any buyer would probably take a selfish interest in buying the pipeline. They presumably wouldn't factor in other benefits other than to shareholders if they were to buy the pipeline, assuming it's a private sector entity or a non-resident entity, as it could happen, being foreign purchasers. So they wouldn't be concerned about the benefits, the broader benefits, economic activity, and so on. So they would very likely look at the returns on their investment. And that's why we did the same thing as a private sector buyer would look at.
Mr. Giroux, further to our last questions, there's no serious forecaster in the world that looks at energy production and sees a decrease in the amount of oil produced in the year in the world in the next few years. There's no serious forecaster or Western democracy that doesn't see Canada's contribution to that oil as being fundamental for world security and for greenhouse gas emissions, because we have very good social outcomes and very good environmental outcomes. Therefore, the main risk that I see in this, in your analysis, is the risk brought on by government, including what they announced 2 weeks ago, where they're looking at cutting production from Canada. So that's going to be a risk not just to the value of this project, but to energy security around the world and to environmental outcomes around the world. Are you free to comment?
As I said before, and in response to Ms. Blaney's question, what a potential buyer sees as the future direction of government policies with respect to oil and gas production and environmental standards and so on will affect their willingness to pay a certain amount for the pipeline. On the issue of broader energy security worldwide, I don't think I'm the best person to comment on that, as it depends on a lot of factors.
Thank you. When you talk about cost of capital, the one thing that's going to affect the cost of capital here, of course, is that uncertainty that this government's going to visit upon a buyer, where suddenly the status quo changes, as it does repeatedly with this government and their policies towards the oil and gas industry. Therefore, any buyer is going to require a guarantee that the ground isn't going to shift beneath their feet. And that guarantee is going to have to be given by this government, which is going to be a cost. Further to that, there's two parts of tolls. There's the fixed part of tolls and there's the variable part of tolls. if we reduced oil production in Canada by 1 million barrels a day, that fixed part of the tolls would be shared amongst a smaller number of barrels. Therefore, that fixed cost would go up, and that would impact, of course, Canadian economic activity. Have you calculated how much that would reduce Canadian economic activity?
No, we have not looked at the broader impacts on Canadian economic activity of different oil-producing scenarios. We have looked at the value, potential value of the pipeline's operations, acquisition, and potential sales, but not the broader economic impacts under various different scenarios of oil and gas production in the country.
Thank you. The pipeline itself, I'm going to drill into some numbers here. When you talked about, or when the government bought this pipeline, it was supposed to cost $7.4 billion for the expansion when it was Kinder Morgan. And in 2020, you estimated that was up at $12.6 billion because it was suddenly more expensive. In 2022, your number was $21.4 billion, and now that number, as it turns out, is $34.2 billion. So it's increased by a factor 5 times. So, this is a significant increase. And if you look at a comparable pipeline, CGL up in northern BC went up by almost a factor of 2, not 5. So you can talk about engineering, and that was a new pipeline and a new route. So the question I think Canadians want to know, Mr. Giroux, where did the money go?
That's a very interesting question. And we didn't do an audit of what happened in the construction phase, or whether the funds were well spent, or whether there would have been better ways to proceed with the expansion. That is a mission more appropriate for an auditor or an auditor general to look at, and it's not within my mandate to look at that type of mission.
Well, thank you. Would you recommend this cost analysis about where all the $27 billion of excess spending from the government of Canada to produce a necessary pipeline to get our most important resource egress to markets, would you think that's something that should bear some auditing at the government level?
I think it's certainly worth exploring, and that is something that this committee might well wish to look at, given the billions of dollars at stake.
Well, thank you very much. The whole thing we're looking at here, and let's look at, the lack of connection between the value of this pipeline, if you will, which is predicated upon a supply of oil getting to market, getting to Tidewater, and yet 2 weeks ago you've got 2 ministers coming out saying we're effectively going to be cutting Canadian production by 1 million barrels a day. And I'll quote, from Michael Belenky.
Mr. McLean, your time is up for your question. You can maybe ask in the next round. So I will.
Can I just ask the question for you?
Next round. I mean, you'll have another opportunity, or somebody on your team will. Thank you.
In considering the fluctuating global energy prices and the increasing competitiveness in the energy market, your report, as I understand it, covers 2 potential scenarios. Can you elaborate on the considerations the report touches on regarding future market conditions that might impact the profitability of the pipeline?
Okay. So I think that for the purpose of the report, we kind of assumed 2 different scenarios, just given that there is uncertainty in terms of what's going to happen. So I think, as Mr. Giroux said, there is just a lot of uncertainty after the initial 20 years of the contract. So the 2 different scenarios kind of represent kind of two possible scenarios, but not kind of a full outlook in terms of what could potentially happen.
So, just to complement on Jason's point, we didn't look at market conditions per se. We just looked at 2 scenarios for the pipeline, because market conditions could vary due to the oil production level. Could also vary if there was another way of transporting Canadian oil. So we saw with the U.S. elections, Keystone XL could be back on the drawing board, or could become a possibility. And even in the absence of changes in oil production levels, that could affect the profitability or the the utilization rate of TMX.
When we had the Minister of Finance here, she gave a statement, something along the lines of, I hope that we're going to sell it for more than the $34 billion it took to build it. Given the report that you've written, that's not very likely, is it?
As I said, we don't think that's the price that a willing buyer would be willing to pay for the pipeline. It doesn't mean that nobody will be willing to pay more than what we estimate. It depends on their perspective of the future direction of Canadian environmental policy, oil production, their cost of capital, for example, whether they partner with other groups, such as Indigenous groups, which could make it more desirable. Some may see that as less desirable if such conditions were imposed. So there's a lot of variables that come into play, but based on numbers and the discount rate that CDEV is using, we don't think the government will make a profit by selling this pipeline, but we could be proven wrong.
Do you think the government was using numbers different than what you had available to you as part of the study that maybe would have given them the ability to say that, possibly?
Well, one of the important factors in assessing the value of a pipeline for prospective buyers, the discount rate, and we use the same one as the government is using. So that's a big factor. The other ones are the future tolling framework, and I don't know that there's any change that's been announced or that's in the pipeline. Maybe the government has information as to interest that has been expressed to them from prospective buyers who are very interested, but we're not aware of any such discussions or prospective buyers having indicated an interest. So by and large, the government would be using the same numbers as we are using.
Okay. Yeah, because I think when you look at how we got to where we are today, I mean, the original proponent was going to build this project, and it wasn't necessarily, I wouldn't say it was a lack of interest on their part. I think what happened, and they've made it pretty clearly known, it was a lack of political will and regulatory certainty. I mean, they already had the approval in place, and then the goalposts kept moving repeatedly, and those delays and the lack of clarity and certainty by the government is what ultimately chased them away, and then forced the government to step in and buy this pipeline, right? And as a prospective buyer looking to spend, I mean, a buyer's probably going to want to buy it for as little as possible to maximize their revenue, right? I mean, that just is good business sense on their part. We're here to defend the taxpayer's dollar at the end of it, and we're looking at what the government has spent on it. But when you look at government regulation, again, it prevented the proponent from building. And then you look at the pancaking of these new regulations, like the emissions cap, their fuel regulations that they're imposing, the carbon tax, the way it's being piled in on top of things. It's, as a proponent, why, where's the future going to be for these guys if you're going to spend that kind of money on a project, and yet this is what's happening? And how do they expect to get full value when they're really they're pretty much literally shooting themselves in the foot here, shooting the taxpayer in the foot by imposing all these policies on people? Like, that's got to be a painful pill to swallow for a prospective buyer, no?
That's a very good point. The government is currently in a situation where it owns an asset, and the value of that asset is determined in part by its own policies on oil and gas production, on environmental policies. So the point you raised is something that is very valid, and that's probably why the government is maybe interested in selling, because it doesn't want to be judge and party at the same time. It owns a big asset, but it regulates in a way that affects quite directly its value. So a prospective buyer would have to consider that. The environment in which it will evolve determines the value of that asset.
The pipeline has completed. We see the utilization is going up. Do you see a scenario that all of these risks should put us in a position to be able to use a lower discount rate, which by default increases the value of that. So please.
Yeah, if you look at the situation in 2018 compared to now, the risks have significantly gone down because the pipeline has been expanded, it's in operation. So these types of risks related to the construction and the operation of the pipeline have gone down significantly. So the oil is flowing. So from that perspective, risks have gone down, which suggests a lower discount rate. The risks that remain relate to future oil demand, which could be affected by the demand on the world markets, the price at which the oil, Canadian oil, can be sold compared to cheaper alternatives, if that was the case, and whether or not policies, not just in Canada, but globally, will affect oil demand. So that's why there is still an element of risk. The question as to whether a lower discount rate should be used is a very valid question, and I'm sure that various proponents or potential buyers could see a different discount rate being applied, be it higher or lower. That's why, this being subjective and a value judgment, we decided to use CDEVs because they benefit from the expertise of owning and operating the pipeline indirectly, and also having a good window as to the potential market and government policies, as each and every one of us. We could have gone for a lower or maybe higher discount rate, and recognizing that it is a value judgment. That's why we have the sensitivity analysis in our report, because others can have a different perspective on the proper discount rate to use, and they can look at a sensitivity analysis that we perform to use a slightly different discount rate.
I just want to clarify a few things. So the initial cost of purchasing the TMX was 4.5, construction cost of 34.2 billion, for a total of 38.7 billion, or 39 billion dollars. What is the likelihood of the government of Canada recovering that cost on a sale?
Based on the assessment we did on the two scenarios, we don't think it is the most likely outcome that the government will recover all the money it has spent acquiring and expanding the Trans Mountain pipeline.
Your report also indicates an equity position of 8.3 billion. Where did that come from?
It came from the corporation's own annual report. Trans Mountain.
TMX, Trans Mountain? Okay.
Yeah.
So when the government bought it, they bought an equity position, presumably?
Yeah, they bought the existing pipeline and the rights to expand the pipeline.
Okay. There's been a lot of discussion here about the discount rate. CDEV and yourselves concluded an 8% discount rate prior to the announcement of proposing an emissions cap. How will that affect the discount rate?
It's hard to assess for sure. One can speculate that it could further increase the discount rate, given that it limits the emissions of the oil and gas sector in the country.
The emissions would produce would create a scenario where they would be producing about a million barrels a day less oil and gas. Is that correct?
We haven't done the analysis yet. There's work that is started in my office, given the recent release of the regulations.
And the expansion portion of the TMX is able to facilitate what kind of volume on a daily basis? Do you know?
So
my question is it basically the equivalent of the cap discount?
Yeah, so the max capacity for the expansion pipeline is, I believe, 590,000 barrels per day. But the impact in terms of the oil and gas cap, we haven't really factored that in.
Okay. So you haven't really factored that in? Okay. Fair enough. What would the toll rate have to be in order to generate a $39 billion sale price?
Do you know?
No, we haven't done.
Yeah, we haven't done that analysis. Not the toll rate itself. We use scenarios where pipeline utilization or the tolling structure, long-term versus shorter-term contracts, but not the level themselves.
How could you do that analysis without those levels?
Well, the long-term contracts have a value that is, yeah, they have a longer-term utilization rate, which guarantees an income stream, whereas the shorter-term contracts are more unlikely in terms of revenues that flow into this corporation, the owning corporation.
Okay, and that is something the Canadian Energy Regulator determines anyway.
Exactly.
And if the toll rates do get increased, who pays?
It's the oil producer.
Okay.
If the toll rates are higher, it's the oil producer using the pipeline who end up paying.
So they will pay even though there's a world market price for the oil.
So, yes.
So it just increases their costs,
Exactly.
reduces their profitability, reduces the taxes paid to the Canadian government.
That's a very good 5-second summary of what happens. Exactly.
Okay. So on a going forward basis, what will interest rates do to the value? You based it on what interest rate? Is maybe a better question to start with.
Yeah, we based it on the CDEV scenario interest rate, right? No.
Yeah. So we based it on kind of the projections of based on their publicly available documents in terms of what their borrowing rates are. That would be factored into the discount rate that is used as part of the 8%. So it's based on kind of the rates that the corporation has. There is a portion that's.
So would you have used the commercially available rates through national banks, or would you have used the sovereign rate for the government of Canada?
So it would be based on the borrowing rate that the corporation has, but again, in terms of how they specifically calculate it, I think it's best placed with CDEV because we assumed that the same discount rate that they had. There is a portion of the debt financing that is kind of on a fixed basis, as well as for the initial borrowing, as well as then the market rates with the syndicated banks. But again, that would factor into the discount rate, but they would be best placed in terms of providing the exact rates.
And maybe I can complement that.
Mr. Drew, just very quick, short. Go ahead.
Okay. There's a hybrid. So Trans Mountain Corporation has financing from the government through the subsidiaries, but they also have some financing through commercial banks. So they have a hybrid. And to answer your question, what happens if interest rates go down, the discount rate would normally go down as well because it's determined quite closely with the prevailing interest rates and the longer term interest rates as well.
I wanted to clarify, you did not, when you did this report, do any analysis of what the impact would be on a cap on emissions from oil and gas on the sale. Is that correct?
You're right, we did not.
Okay. And also, so that I can be clear, when you were doing this report, did you calculate the impact of different tax credits for carbon capture?
No, we did not because we didn't think that was material in the ownership and operation of a pipeline.
Thank you. I hear that the members opposite are choosing to chirp a little bit about my questions, which I find interesting because I will just say that I'm just trying to clarify what was in the report and what the pieces were. I believe that's something that everyone here has had a chance to speak to.